The story begins with an aging war veteran, a once recognizable actor who had faded from the spotlight years ago, quietly walking through the quieter streets of his small town on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of day that felt forgotten by the world itself, when his eyes caught a banner crudely tied to a leaning utility pole that read, "Buying metal, top prices, call Jim," in large black lettering that had started to bleed from the rain. And while it seemed insignificant at first, something about the name, or maybe just the simplicity of the offer, pulled at him because he had a few rusted sheets and coils piled in his shed ever since the renovation that never got finished. And lately, he had been looking for ways to clean up his place. Not for anyone in particular, but just because he had started to feel like his surroundings were growing stale and unmanageable, just like him. So he pulled out his phone, tapped in the number with the same slow deliberateness that had come to define most of his actions over the last decade. And after a few rings, a man answered with a flat voice, businesslike, but not unfriendly. And after a short exchange of details, they agreed to meet the following afternoon at a quiet spot near the industrial edge of town. And while the call was brief and matter of fact, something about the cadence of the voice on the other end tugged at a part of the veteran's mind that hadn't been stirred in a long time, like a melody half remembered from a dream. But he didn't dwell on it, just jotted the time down on a scrap of paper and went back to his walk, though he kept replaying the voice in his head. Not because it was strange, but because it felt familiar in a way that made no sense. And by the time he got home, the sky had turned an uncommitted shade of silver, and the air smelled faintly of distant rain and wet metal. And as he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the phone on his dresser, he realized that it wasn't just about selling the metal anymore. Something was scratching beneath the surface, just out of reach, something unfinished, something that had waited half a century to surface. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, he felt it moving inside him, slow and certain like a tide turning after decades of stillness. And without knowing why, he found himself digging through his old trunk, the one he hadn't opened in years, pushing aside faded photographs and worn ribbons. And when his hand brushed against a familiar patch, stitched in the field by someone whose name he never knew, a strange coldness passed through his chest and settled there, not painful but heavy, like an echo of a weight once carried and never fully dropped. And that night, lying awake with the old patch on his nightstand and the name Jim still circling like a hawk in his thoughts, he knew something was coming, something real and impossible and inevitable. And though the world outside remained quiet and unbothered, in his gut he felt it, an approaching shift, a reunion he didn't know he had been waiting for, a story that hadn't finished telling itself, not yet, not even close. He arrived at the agreed location the next afternoon, a quiet service yard tucked behind an old factory with rusting fences and an oil-stained concrete lot that smelled faintly of diesel and rain-soaked metal. And as he approached with the back of his car weighed down by the sheets and scraps he'd loaded that morning, he saw a man already waiting near a white pickup truck, arms crossed, head lowered slightly as he checked his watch. And something in the man's posture, calm but alert, struck him, not because it was out of the ordinary, but because it felt precisely the opposite, like a gesture carved in muscle memory. And when he stepped closer, he could see the man more clearly, perhaps in his early 70s like himself, tall, wiry, with hands that looked like they could still handle a rifle or fix a broken axle. And on the chest of his worn, olive work jacket, half hidden beneath a strap of his overalls, was a metal insignia dulled by time, but still unmistakable, the kind given to soldiers in a specific campaign, during a very specific year. And for a moment, everything around the veteran slowed. The sounds of the nearby street faded, and the distant hum of the town blurred into nothing as he stared at the badge and the man wearing it, and something primal stirred in his stomach. Not a memory exactly, but a moment frozen in his bloodstream, and he found himself stepping closer, voice low but steady, as he asked almost absently, "Were you there?" And the man looked up at him, clearly puzzled at first, but then nodded slowly with the kind of silent recognition that doesn't require elaboration, and the veteran took a breath, his voice rough now, not from age but from the past, and asked again more directly, "Is your name Josh?" And for a split second something flickered in the other man's face. Confusion, alarm, curiosity. And then he said yes, cautiously, as if unsure whether to admit it, and asked, "How do you know that?" And the veteran just stared at him, at his eyes, at the way they darted for a second like they were trying to find a way out of something. And then he said it, plain and unceremoniously. "You were lying in that field, half buried, barely breathing through the dirt, and someone pulled you out." And the man froze, his breath caught mid-inhale, his entire expression shifting in a way that felt almost involuntary, the kind of reaction that can't be faked or prepared for. And he said, "Yes, yes, that was me. How the hell do you know that?" And for a long second, they both stood there, neither moving. Two aging strangers connected by something so buried and specific that the weight of it hung between them like thick smoke. And the veteran didn't answer right away, just stared at him like he was waiting for the rest of the memory to return on its own. And then, finally, he stepped forward and said quietly, "Because I was the one who pulled you out." And the moment that followed didn't belong to the present. It belonged to that long dead battlefield, to the stifling air, the smell of blood and dust and something burning just beyond the trees. And for the first time since he'd made that call the day before, the veteran realized what had been pulling at him, what had been scratching at the walls of his thoughts. And now, seeing the man's face twist slowly from disbelief to shock, and then to something much harder to name, something that trembled just beneath the surface, he knew that what had happened back then hadn't ended in that field, because here it was again, breathing between them, reshaping the world in the span of a few seconds. And Josh blinked slowly, as if trying to confirm the reality of the moment, then took a small, unconscious step forward like a man waking from a 40-year coma. And he looked down at the ground and then back up into the veteran's face, his mouth slightly open, but no words coming out. And for a moment, there was only silence. A silence so heavy, it seemed to press against their chests. And then the veteran reached into his pocket, pulled out a photo so worn, its edges had begun to curl, and handed it to Josh, who took it with trembling fingers. And when he looked at it, the breath left his body in a way that was almost audible, because in the photo was a group of soldiers sitting against a ruined wall, all young and dirty and grinning despite the chaos behind them. And in the far corner, barely visible, was a figure lying on a stretcher, pale and unconscious, face turned to the side, unmistakably Josh. And suddenly his legs seemed to weaken as he sat down hard on the edge of the pickup's tailgate, holding the photo like it was made of glass. And he just kept shaking his head, whispering the same question over and over. How is this possible? After all this time? And the veteran didn't answer. Because he didn't have an answer, he just stood there, watching this man, this stranger and not stranger, grapple with the impossible fact that some pieces of the past don't stay buried, that sometimes history finds a way to finish what it started, even if it takes half a century. And the weight of what they had both survived began to fill the space between them, not with noise, but with the kind of silence that contains everything, the kind that doesn't demand words but understands them before they're spoken. And for the first time in years, the veteran felt something strange pass through him. Not relief exactly, but a kind of closure he didn't know he needed, though it didn't feel like an ending, not yet, because there was more to say, more to remember, more to confront. And even though the air was thick with memory and ghosts, there was a strange sense of calm in it too, as if the universe had bent just slightly to allow this impossible intersection. And neither of them knew what would come next. But in that moment, beneath the gray sky and rusted fences, two lives, separated by decades and 1,000 silent battles, had suddenly become entangled again. And whatever this was, coincidence, fate, unfinished business, it was only just beginning. The veteran stood there for a moment longer, watching the disbelief ripple across Josh's face as if he were looking into a mirror that had been buried for decades and only now unearthed. And then, with a quiet voice that seemed to carry the weight of 50 years and 1,000 untold memories, he simply said, "Brother, it was me who saved you." And the words, though calm, hit like a hammer wrapped in cloth, because something in Josh's chest visibly caved under the weight of the recognition. And for a few long seconds, he couldn't speak, couldn't even blink, just stared at the man in front of him, like time had collapsed in on itself. And then the expression on his face cracked, something between awe and heartbreak, and he slowly rose from the tailgate and reached out his hand, only to be pulled into a tight, rough embrace that neither of them seemed to realize had started until it was happening. And in that single, wordless moment, decades of silence dissolved into the kind of reunion that can only happen once in a lifetime. And both men standing in an empty lot surrounded by rust and dust and the mundane details of modern life, held on to each other like brothers long presumed dead. And when they finally stepped back, wiping at their eyes without apology, Josh muttered something about how surreal it all was and how there was no way this was happening, but the veteran just smiled faintly and nodded because there was no explaining it, just the acceptance of a truth that had waited quietly for its moment. And then Josh, still visibly shaken but now smiling through it, insisted that the veteran come to his house for lunch, said his wife would kill him if she found out he'd met someone like this and didn't bring him over. And despite a polite protest, the veteran agreed, and they drove separately, but arrived minutes apart to a modest one-story home, nestled in an older neighborhood, lined with sycamores and quiet sidewalks. And as soon as Josh opened the door, calling out to his wife with an edge of excitement in his voice that clearly hadn't been there in years, the warmth of the house wrapped around them like a blanket, and moments later, a woman with silvering hair and kind eyes appeared, wiping her hands on a towel and pausing mid-step when she saw the veteran, clearly curious but respectful. And Josh introduced them quickly, offering only the broad strokes of their connection, saying, "This man saved my life," without explaining how, and before long they were sitting around a dining table cluttered with simple dishes: roast chicken, boiled potatoes, a salad already half dressed, and the veteran was quietly absorbing the strange comfort of being in someone else's home, surrounded by family photos and the low murmur of a TV in another room. And after a bit of hesitant conversation and laughter, the full story came out. Not all at once, but in fragments, moments recalled and pieced together like glass shards from a long broken window. And as the veteran spoke, describing the heat, the chaos, the impossible decision to crawl toward a motionless body in the dirt, Josh's family leaned in, eyes wide, faces still, and for the first time in his life, the veteran felt the full weight of that day lifted, not erased, but no longer his alone. And when he finished, there was a silence that wasn't empty, but full, filled with awe and reverence and the soft, stunned gratitude of people realizing they owe something precious to a stranger who had never asked for thanks. And later, after the plates were cleared and the coffee poured, they sat together on the back porch, watching the wind stir the trees while Josh talked about the decades in between, how he'd carried survivor's guilt without knowing exactly who he owed his life to, and how he'd wondered 1,000 times about the man who had pulled him from the dirt and vanished like a ghost.